Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, GoodPods. Whatever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As for our social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza, and I have an email address which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com, where you can send any feedback, any suggestions. They're always welcome and appreciated. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and leave a review if the app allows you to do so. And like I said, if you have any feedback, any suggestions, you can always submit those via email or via social media. And they are definitely welcome and appreciated. And thank you for the support. And if you haven't listened to the previous episode of Let's Talk Micro, please go ahead and do so. It was a great episode about veterinary microbiology with Kelly Maddock and Sarah Geffro from the North Dakota State University Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. Sarah and Kelly, they are medical laboratory scientists that made the decision to work in a veterinary lab. They really enjoy it. They're very passionate. And they just, they joined the podcast to talk about, what they do. They talk about the training, how long does it take, the qualifications to work in a veterinary lab. How being in MLS was definitely a plus. They talk about the things that you have to keep in mind when you work in cultures, like environmental factors. Sometimes, the animals have been dead for a couple days or they have been dead for a while before the owner finds them and then they decide to send a sample. So they have to keep those things in mind when you're working cultures. And, as always, some organisms, they're part of the normal flora, which, like, for example, like Pastorella, which is normal flora, in dogs and cats, but it's pathogenic in humans. So you're going to have that mindset where some organisms, they're flora of the animals. But overall, I think it was a great episode learning about, the testing that they do. They talked about antimicrobials. They talked about the CLSI. So definitely, it was a great episode. So please check it out if you haven't done so already. And today's episode is about malaria. We have definitely heard about some cases of malaria in the United States. So it was definitely a good opportunity to do an episode about malaria. And in this episode, I have Dr. Kenneth Gavina from the Indiana University School of Medicine. He was a guest on the Francisella episode. Great episode. If you haven't checked it out, please go ahead and do so. And he joins the podcast to talk about malaria. And as always, in the spirit of Let's Talk Micro, we break it down. And, we go over the disease. We talk about the life cycle. And there are some interesting links in the show notes where I'm putting the link from the CDC for the malaria life cycle. We talk about testing, we talk about prevention, we talk about vaccines. So definitely a great episode. He even talks about the origins of the word malaria. So it was a very informative episode. I love having Dr. Gavina on. He's very passionate, very energetic. So it is a great episode. So I hope you enjoy it. And Dr. Gavina also talks about the Future of Malaria Research Symposium, which is taking place Friday, October 13th of this year at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, Maryland. And this is a hybrid event, and I am putting the links on the show notes so you can check it out if this is something that interests you. So let's go ahead and listen to the episode. So on today's episode, we are talking, we're talking micro, but at the same time, this is a topic that since this parasite, it is it's worked on other areas of the lab, due to the nature of the reagents, and it involves hematology. So we are basically talking lab. So definitely, we are all familiar about this, especially as medical lab scientists. If you might see it on the news. So I thought it would be good to talk about malaria. So with me today, I have Dr. Kenneth Gavina, and he was a guest on the Francisella episode. If you haven't listened to that one, please go ahead and check it out. So Dr. Gavina is going to be talking about malaria today. Dr. Gavina, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hi, Louise. It's great to be back.
My pleasure. So like I mentioned, you've been a guest before, but let's go ahead and start with a quick introduction for those of us that are just tuning in for the first time.
Of course. So, my name is Ken Gavina. I'm the medical director of clinical microbiology and serology here at Eskenazi Health in Indianapolis. I'm also the director of the Molecular Diagnostics Innovation Group at IU Health and an assistant professor of clinical pathology and laboratory medicine at Indiana University School of Medicine. I completed my PhD in medical microbiology and immunology at the University of Alberta in Canada under my former advisor, Dr. Stephanie Yano, who is just an amazingly brilliant global health scientist. And there we worked on developing molecular point of care diagnostics for malaria and also investigated the clinical impacts of malaria in pregnancy.
Well, definitely great to have you back. And the audience, you cannot see this, but I like, Dr. Gavina actually, he has like a Yeti microphone, so that's always amazing. I love it when I'm talking to someone and they come like full on prepared. So that's great. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about malaria. Just in the spirit of Let's Talk Micro, we'd really like to, break it down, right? Make it as simple as we can. So let's go ahead and go over, like species, transmission and things like that.
Yeah, it sounds good. I wanted to thank you for having me for this topic, as malaria is definitely one of my first loves in the world of microbiology. And to try and get some of our listeners as excited about it as I am, I thought I'd start with some fun facts, maybe about malaria. And the first one that kind of comes to mind is that it's actually one of the oldest diseases known to mankind. It's been documented as far back as 2700 BC in historical Chinese medical writing, like the Nei Ching, and even like the Greek doctrine of fevers by Hippocrates in 4th century BC. In fact, the name malaria itself actually originates from 18th century Italian, the words mala and aria, which directly translates to bad air. So this is something that they proposed before they obviously knew it was a vector-borne disease. But malaria is it's caused by the protozoan parasite Plasmodium genus. There are hundreds of species in the genus, but really there are five main players in regards to human infections. And these five species are Plasmodium falciparum, Vivax, Ovale, Malariae, and Knowlesi. There are a couple other lesser known Plasmodium species that are mostly zoonotic, and there's been some spillover events. So one that's happened fairly recently in the last few years is one known as Plasmodium simium, which is highly related to Plasmodium vivax. And Plasmodium simium is known for infecting New World monkeys in Brazil. So I thought that's just a cool little tidbit that I'd share as well. Talking about the transmission, so as most of us are probably well aware, that malaria is a vector-borne disease, and it's transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito. So when an infected mosquito goes for a blood meal, the parasites are injected into the animal or the human host. But of course, there are other rare transmissions that have been reported and include things such as blood transfusions, organ transplants, and even the sharing of needles or syringes that have been contaminated with infected blood. Another transmission route is congenital, which, spoiler alert, we may talk about a little bit more later in this episode.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on it. So as far as what about endemic areas? Where can we, what areas can we typically find malaria?
Yeah, so malaria is one of the leading causes of parasitic disease in the world. There's an estimated 250 million cases globally, and almost an estimated 620,000 deaths in 2021 alone. These are the most recent stats that were published by the 2022 World Health Organization malaria report. And probably the most alarming statistic, but maybe not too surprising, is that sub-Saharan Africa accounts for over 95% of these cases and deaths, with almost 80% of these deaths in these regions attributable to children under the age of 5. So a very serious disease, of course. But despite this, we still do see endemic areas of malaria outside of Africa as well. And examples of this include Southeast Asia, as well as a little bit closer to home here in the United States, in Latin America. I'm sure, have you seen in the news that we now have some locally transmitted cases of malaria here in the United States as well, which is quite alarming. And I think also speaks volume to the climate change and how this is directly tied into zoonosis and human disease as well. One interesting fun fact is that while Plasmodium falciparum accounts for the overwhelming majority of all Plasmodium human infections, Plasmodium vivax is actually the most globally distributed species of human malaria across the world and accounts for more than 50% of all malaria-causing cases outside of Africa. And the reason for this, we can talk about this in a little bit more detail too, is it's due to the parasite's tolerance to cooler temperatures. So one of the things that's involved in the malaria life cycle is schizogeny. And Plasmodium vivax has the ability to withstand cooler temperatures. We're talking maybe 18 to 21, 25 environmental degrees Celsius. So we see it a lot more prevalent in temperate climates compared to Plasmodium falciparum.
Thank you for that, and I like, thank you for the trivia as well. I think that's something that right that an educator has, that when you're talking about something, you like to provide as much information as you can, and I'm sure the audience and I do, we appreciate it. So, we can definitely, and for the listeners, I will put the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. They have a great visuals about the cycle of the malaria, and I'm definitely going to put the link there on the show notes. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Can you talk a little bit about the life cycle?
Of course. So I'm glad that you mentioned the CDC reference for the malaria life cycle link. I'm sure all of our listeners have seen it on the website or in a textbook or some other place. And I think we can all agree that it initially it is quite intimidating. It is a quite complex life cycle, albeit I think it's also a very beautiful life cycle to look at too when you understand what's going on. To simplify it, the way I like to think of the malaria life cycle is I like to think of it as two different stages containing three different cycles. So you have your human or the asexual stage of the parasite, which contains two different cycles, the pre-erythrocytic cycle and the erythrocytic cycle. And then you have the mosquito or the sexual stage, and this contains the sporogonic cycle of the parasite. So if we kind of start of how the infection begins as like the beginning of our life cycle, we start with our hungry infected Anopheles mosquito. And you have these formed sporozoites that are within the salivary glands of the mosquito. They get injected into the host whenever the mosquito goes for a blood meal. And we're talking about a few hundred sporozoites every time it feeds. So this is the start of the pre-erythrocytic cycle. And these sporozoites, they break through the endothelial barrier, entering the bloodstream, and then they eventually migrate their way towards the liver to infect hepatocytes. Within the hepatocyte in the liver, the parasite undergoes nuclear replication, eventually forming a mature liver schizont. And in the case of falciparum, this can take anywhere between a period of 5 to 7 days and result in schizonts that contain several thousand myrizoites. And these myrizoites are individual budded parasite cells. It's worth noting, though, that during this pre-erythrocytic cycle, patients are generally asymptomatic. And even more important, worth mentioning, is that not all sporozoites that enter the hepatic cell will immediately become a liver stage schizont. In the case of Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale, an alternative developmental pathway are the formation of these parasite forms known as hypnozoites. What's really interesting about these hypnozoites is that they can remain dormant for several weeks, months, or even years before reactivating and becoming schizonts. And the mechanism behind the development into dormancy or the activation of them is not really well understood. I've seen a case where we had a patient who presented to the emergency department with suspicion of influenza. This was in January at the time, but ended up being diagnosed with Plasmodium vivax. And the patient hadn't left the country in over 8 months. So it was a particularly fascinating case that we came across. But kind of going back to the life cycle, you now have these liver schizonts which rupture. And when they rupture, they release these several myrizoites into the bloodstream. And then the parasites go on to infect red blood cells. So this is the start of that second cycle, the erythrocytic cycle. And it's at this point we start to see many of the classical symptoms of malaria, such as fevers, chills, and night sweats. Once the myrizoites are in the red blood cells, They once again undergo asexual development, starting as an immature trophozoite, or as what many of us refer to known as the ring stage parasite. And as the parasite continues to feed off the hemoglobin and grow, it further develops into a mature trophozoite and then eventually becomes a schizont, which, depending on the species of Plasmodium, can look very different and can contain anywhere between 8 to 32 individual merozoite buds. So when these infected red blood cells lyse, the merozoites are then released back into the bloodstream, allowing for infection of new red blood cells, and then the erythrocytic cycle continues. Um, One thing that's worth noting is that a subset of these parasites will cease asexual reproduction and instead will then differentiate into the sexual stage of the parasite, known as the gametocyte. You can have male and female gametocytes, and these gametocytes act as a means of continuing the parasite life cycle, as they can be picked up by another female Anopheles mosquito when that mosquito goes for a blood meal. And then they further undergo development in the midgut of the mosquito, eventually becoming a sporozoite containing oocyst in the salivary gland of the mosquito. And then you have the cycle beautifully starting all over again.
Wow, that's fascinating. And as you were talking about that case, and it makes me think. So they came with a suspecting maybe like flu, and then you go through your standard laboratories and maybe get like get a CBC, and then you're doing a differential, and it's like, wait a minute, it's like, is this malaria here? So it's always amazing the things that we see, and how sometimes we can be surprised, right? It's amazing.
It was particularly odd, again, because not only was it in the middle of January when we encountered this patient, but this was also kind of in the prairies in Canada. So you can imagine, January in Canada, malaria isn't exactly going to be at the top of your list for differential for fevers.
Wow, indeed. Um, okay, so you talked a little bit sometimes, about patients, at some stage symptomatic. So can we talk about symptoms, and what diseases, what do you see with malaria?
Yeah, of course. The manifestation of disease and the symptoms of malaria is very broad, actually, ranging anywhere between like asymptomatic infection to severe malaria. And severe malaria can include multiple organ failure. You can see cases of cerebral malaria, and in the worst case scenario, even death. So, based on the life cycle that I described, you can probably figure out that many of these clinical symptoms of malaria are due to the destruction of red blood cells. So some of these symptoms, again, include fever, chills, headaches, sweating, dizziness, myalgia, and several others. But there are other mechanisms of pathogenicity as well. And one of them is the production of hemazoin. So hemazoin is a byproduct of digested hemoglobin of the red blood cells. These hemazoins might sometimes be referred to as malarial pigment, which you can actually see sometimes when you're doing a blood smear looking for malaria. But they act as a blood toxin, and these can also accumulate in organs such as the spleen and liver, which can give you symptomologies of splenomegaly or hepatomegaly. Fever in malaria tends to follow a paroxysmal or a cyclical pattern. So you might have heard the terms tertian or quartan fever, or a fever that appears every 3 to 4 days, respectively. And this is due to the amount of time schizogeny takes. So in Vivax and Ovale, this typically is 48 hours-ish, hence the term tertian fever. And then in Malaria, schizogeny takes roughly 72 hours, hence quartan fever. Plasmodium falciparum, on the other hand, typically does not follow any distinct periodicity, and it kind of tends to have its own agenda and does what it wants. Falciparum in particular is really associated with severe disease, as it's capable of producing much higher parasitemias than some of the other species, but will also sequester and form these clusters of infected red blood cells. These sequestrations and alterations on the surface of the red blood cells will cause them to become really sticky and cytoadhere to each other and blood vessels. And what this ends up doing is it causes an obstruction of the microcirculation. So this results in the dysfunction of organs. And most notably, and probably the most severe example we hear of, is cerebral malaria. That would be a great example of this kind of mechanism behind it.
Okay, thank you for that. And we kind of hinted a little bit, and we talked about it, but and we have chatted about this offline. So I know you mentioned that you studied malaria and pregnancy, and so let's go ahead and talk about that. What can you tell us about malaria and pregnancy?
Yeah. So, what a lot of people may not know, particularly because we don't see a malaria a lot here in the United States, although that may change. But it's a very serious congenital infection. In regions where malaria is endemic, the general recommendation is usually some sort of combination of antenatal screening for malaria and intermittent preventative treatment in pregnancy, sometimes referred to as IPTP. This is usually going to be with the drug sulfadoxine pyrimethamine. So, malaria in pregnancy poses a very significant risk to both the mother and the fetus, and it can lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes such as low birth weight, preterm birth, maternal and neonatal anemia, or fetal mortality by stillbirth or spontaneous abortion. Congenital malaria, it can result in significant inflammatory responses or damage to the placenta. And the mechanism behind this is due to placental sequestration. So similar to what I described with falciparum, is that these infected red blood cells will bind to the placenta and the intervillous spaces, which provides the parasite with a means of immune evasion, but also leads to inflammatory responses and damage in the placenta. What's really fascinating about this, though, is that it appears that there's only a subset of Plasmodium parasites that are capable of expressing this gene, and the gene's called VAR2-CSA. And it's a surface antigen that presents on infected red blood cells that cause placental malaria. So they're binding to the surface of these intervillous spaces and in the placenta. And they only express the VAR2-CSA antigen during pregnancy. So these parasites are very, very clever in terms of their ways to kind of adapt within the system and ways to avoid the immune system.
Wow, that's very interesting. Only expressed during pregnancy. Okay. Um, so now, right, we're laboratorians, so let's talk about testing, right? At the very least, and then if you're in the audience, and I mentioned that in hematology, or you might be, used to looking at the slide, and typically, right, we use terms like like thin smear, thick smear, and then you have sometimes like two or three technologists looking at the slides, and everyone is doing a count. So what type of testing is out there? I know like as molecular makes huge leaps and bounds, and so I've seen antigen. So let's talk about testing.
Yeah. So to this day, microscopy still remains the gold standard for malaria diagnosis. And patient blood samples are, to work them up, they're added to a microscopic slide, and we create what you just referred to as blood smears. Typically, for malaria workup, this is going to vary based to institution, but they recommend at least two types of blood smears, two of each. And the two types of blood smears are going to be a thick smear and a thin smear. So a thick smear, you essentially add your blood to the middle, and then you can use like an applicator stick or the corner of another slide to create a small circular area, usually 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter. And then you allow this smear to fully dry and lyse. And this takes several hours. So it is a stat test that we generally try to get malaria results back out to our providers. But what a lot of them don't understand is how long the process actually takes. Never mind counting the fields, but even just preparing the slides does take a significant amount of time. Once you have that completely dried slide, you then would stain it using a GIMSA, right, or field stain. And then this is going to give you a highly concentrated smear that gives you the advantage of having improved sensitivity to try and find some of these parasites in the blood. In contrast, on a thin smear, you would add your drop of blood to maybe one end of the slide, and then you would kind of use another glass slide to push or glide it across the slide. And the idea behind this is you're trying to make one thin monolayer of red blood cells. These slides are going to be dried and fixed and then stained again in a similar process that you would with the thick smear. But what this will allow for is it's going to give you a better resolution of the parasite morphology. So this is helpful in being able to determine the species of Plasmodium that you're dealing with, or even looking for mixed infections, which are becoming more and more common depending on the region that you're in. So typically for blood smears, we'll start with the thick smear for the workup because this is going to be more concentrated, have a higher sensitivity. And there are guidelines that are set up by the World Health Organization and other governing bodies that they recommend screening a minimum of 100 high-powered fields before ruling out a negative thick smear. We can then reflex to the thin smear to try and determine the species or see if it's a mixed infection or not. One critical component of working up a malaria smear is to be able to report out the percent parasitemia. And this can be done, excuse me, this can be done on both the thick smear, where you count the number of parasites in relations to the white blood cells, or what's more commonly done on the thin smear, where you count the number of parasites in relation to the red blood cells. So with the thick smears, they recommend counting upwards of to 1,000 white blood cells, or anywhere between 500 to 2,000 red blood cells. So you can imagine that that's a lot of fields that you're screening through, and you can very easily get fatigue just from staring and working up all these slides, because one patient, you're looking at least 4 slides. So as you mentioned, we constantly have other colleagues bouncing ideas, seeing what they see, getting a fresh set of eyes definitely helps. It's a very labor intensive process, but again, to this day still remains the gold standard for testing. Now, something that you mentioned was molecular diagnostics. So examples would be PCR, the most common one. Surprisingly, though, there are not any commercially available PCR-based diagnostics for malaria. There is one test. It's a isothermal method. It's LAMP, so loop-mediated isothermal amplification, and it's by Alethia. So it's the Alethia malaria LAMP assay. This has been, I believe, CE marked approved, so for distribution in Europe and I think in Canada as well, but has not quite yet received FDA approval. So it's still not available to us here in the United States. Some larger reference laboratories will offer PCR testing for malaria, but it's usually going to be some kind of laboratory developed test that they made in-house. One really cool technology that I think is in the process of trying to get FDA approval is called the AmpliQuick malaria biosinex. So it's a real-time PCR directly from blood. So it's nice because it completely eliminates the extraction component and simplifies the process for the operator to be able to just run it directly from the blood specimen. More traditionally, aside from microscopy, like we think about rapid diagnostic tests, and these are going to be usually your antigen-based testing. So the one big one is the BinaxNOW malaria, which is a lateral flow-based RDT. And this test is capable of discriminating Plasmodium falciparum from the other species. However, it doesn't tell us what the other species is if that's the case. It could be Ovale, it could be Vivax, it could be Malariae. In which case we would still need to reflex either to microscopy or PCR molecular methods to determine what the species is, because we would want to know if it's Vivax or Ovale to potentially get rid of those dormant stage hypnozoites for radical treatment. The way the test works is it's an antigen-based test that looks for the protein HRP2 or histidine-rich protein 2 that's specific to the Plasmodium parasite. However, what we're seeing now too is there are mutations in that antigen where there's a bit of a dropout. So what we're seeing is false negatives on certain strains of Plasmodium that are being missed by that BinaxNOW malaria. So something to keep in mind for consideration as well is it's a great screening tool, but in most cases you still may want to reflex to traditional microscopy or another means as well.
Yeah, and I think like at my facility, I'm not because I wasn't involved in it, but I think they kind of play a little bit with it with that Binax and they were not really like too satisfied with the results they were getting, and they just kind of stopped it for now. But I remember seeing it now. And for those of us that are, that are listening, those of you that are listening, Binax, and it's not I'm not plug or anything. There's no relationship to the podcast, but they manufacture a lot of tests. So you're definitely familiar, even if you don't work in a microbiology lab and you might have like a quick rapid section, they do like the Legionella, strep pneumo. So there's a lot of tests. So everyone pretty much in the MLS community is familiar with one Binax product or another.
SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, right. Definitely. And I like what you mentioned about that's intensive and to put a visual, yeah, especially when you're in hematology and you're a large facility with large volume and you're doing differentials, for 8 hours, it can be, it's a lot of work. So it's a time consuming test.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now that we went over the testing, what about prevention and treatment?
Oh, I guess I want to give one other plug for maybe another testing method. Um, it's not really novel in the sense of the technology that's there, but maybe how it's being applied. A lot of these tests are still very much kind of research use only or in development, but there's a lot of cool point of care molecular diagnostic tests that are being developed right now. So one of them is a saliva based PCR test that can be done in the field on a handheld instrument. And the idea behind the saliva test is it actually looks specifically for gametocytes. And this is more so for a transmission or an epidemiological screening test as opposed to a clinical test. So it's kind of cool because what you can do is you can screen these people for like Plasmodium gametocytes, and you can see whether or not they are potential vectors for mosquitoes to transmit the disease. I thought that was really neat. Another one that I came across was a wax or a paper-based PCR test. Actually, no, you know what? It was an isothermal-based test where you take the blood and it's actually directly added to this paper wax microfluidic chip. And when you add your reagents, you actually fold the paper and wax together, and then you can put it directly onto a heating plate, which then kind of cycles through the reaction. So we're talking about something that's really, really kind of experimental, but from a cost perspective and usability purpose in the field, it seems highly amenable because you really only need like a water bath or a heat block to do this. And from a material standpoint, you're using wax and paper as opposed to these very sometimes expensive plastics, microfluidic chips that some people use. So I wanted to just mention that really quickly because I got really excited when I was reading it.
No, thank you for that. And are those like is that being worked on like here in the States or other parts of the world, as far as you know?
It sounds like the two groups that I saw were collaborative researchers. So obviously, you're going to have one site kind of in a malaria endemic region where they can do the applied side of it to be able to test it in the field, and then a more developmental side. I've seen some places based in Europe. There's also some places based in the United States where they kind of design the assay and they have the engineering to do it, and then they bring it out for like their collaborators in the field to trial. So it's a great way to further kind of reach out to other colleagues in different areas of microbiology because you have some instances where you don't have the resources to be able to develop it, but on the flip side, you don't have the use case or the need to be able to apply it. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, and we're all helping each other.
Yeah, that is great. And now in an era where we're so connected, it's so much easier to do those types of collaborations. So yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about prevention and treatment.
So prevention is always going to be heavily reliant on vector and transmission control. So the best thing you can do to stop malaria is to just not get it in the first place. So this will typically be vector control. So the use of bed nets is probably the single most effective form of trying to prevent malaria transmission. So insecticide treated bed nets, the use of DDT or DEET or other insecticides. However, that's becoming a less efficient method as well because not only are the parasites evolving and adapting, but the mosquitoes are evolving and adapting. So we're starting to see mosquitoes that are becoming resistant to certain and commercial insecticides that we use as well. So it's typically going to be some kind of combination of multiple interventions to try and prevent malaria. As far as treatment goes, oral chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine are often an effective treatment for Plasmodium infections, but only when they're not chloroquine resistant. And we're seeing a huge increase in the prevalence of chloroquine resistant Plasmodium infections. So in cases when they are chloroquine resistant, there are a couple options that we do have. The preferred option is artemether lumefantrine. A second one is a commercial drug known as Malarone. So this is a tovaquone proguanil. And then you can also use combination therapies like quinine and a tetracycline, like doxycycline. I'll plug in another fun fact for this is that quinine, you can actually find it in one of you're probably at your local bar in a beverage of tonic water. So tonic water does contain quinine in it. So I actually my advisor when I finished my PhD, she bought me a shirt that said gin and tonic because malaria is everywhere. And I still wear that shirt quite regularly.
That's great. Yeah, that is a fact that I remember reading about that. Yeah, about the gin and tonic and the tonic water. Um, so as far as any vaccines that you know of.
Yeah. So um, with the tonic water though, you would have to drink liters of it to reach therapeutic levels. So you would either have a really good night or a really bad night to reach therapeutic levels through gin and tonics. For vaccines, now malaria elimination and vaccine development has been a major challenge for public health and healthcare for decades. There's been over 100 different registered malaria vaccine clinical trials since 2000 alone. I know that probably pales into comparison to some of the vaccine trials that have been done recently with SARS-CoV-2. But malaria is a completely different animal. It's a lot more complex to try and create a vaccine to target because there's so many different stages in the life cycle to target. It's a lot more complex of an organism. A lot of great ideas have been tried, but have failed and failed spectacularly. But we've learned a lot from them. Many of these the vaccines that that have been developed, some of them will target the sporozoite stage. So kind of when the sporozoite enters the body for its first time and tries to make its way to the liver. And this is a good strategy because the idea is if you can stop it in its tracks before it reaches the liver, then you won't have any symptoms whatsoever. You can kind of nip it in the bud. The issue with that is that even if you have one sporozoite break through, that's reason enough, and that's cause enough to cause full-blown malaria because that sporozoite will make its way to the hepatocyte and potentially go through the process of creating several hundred to several thousand myriazoites. So it needs to be 100% effective. So you can understand some of the difficulty that comes to that when you're trying to design a vaccine. There are quite a bit of vaccines that have been designed, but there's only been one vaccine that's been licensed, and this is known as the Mosquirix, or more commonly referred to as the RTSS vaccine. And this has been manufactured by GSK. It's been licensed by the EU. There's been pilot studies done in Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, and I think they've actually introduced it to several other countries in Africa as well. And the vaccine itself is a recombinant or a subunit vaccine that targets the liver stage of the parasite. And it presents a major protein or an antigen called CSP, and it's conjugated to, and I don't know the exact reason why. Somebody much more brilliant than I can probably explain it, but it's conjugated to the surface antigen of hepatitis B. Now, when this vaccine was first introduced, it actually showed very good and promising efficacy. So the original trials showed nearly 70% efficacy in the first 6 months. But then when they looked at additional trials, looking at a 3 versus a 4-dose regimen, they found that vaccine efficacy just continued to decline, even as low as 0 to 15%. So I think there's a lot of promise. I think some protection is better than none, especially when you're going to be looking at these really hot populations. So particularly sub-Saharan Africa, children under the age of 5. That's kind of going to get your best bang for your buck. One new kid on the block, though, is another vaccine called R21. And this was designed by a group out of Oxford. And it's very similar to the RTSS vaccine, that it's based on that same CSP antigen, but they actually have a bigger chunk of it. So rather than just a small portion, it's slightly larger. And it does not use the conjugated hepatitis B surface antigens. But it's shown, initial trials and studies have shown 77% vaccine efficacy over 12 months. So this is very exciting news as well. And I think the World Health Organization is really trying to get this as part of the pilot program to get it started and distributed in Africa. So a lot of good stuff coming, a lot of promising stuff.
Yeah, indeed, sounds like it. So yeah, stay tuned. So is there anything else that you want to add? I know that, and before we gonna come to a close, I know that you wanted to talk about this, and on behalf of the audience, we thank you for doing this and taking the time and just taking some of your time and talking about this. I think it's been great, very informational. Sometimes with malaria we touch on it in school and maybe some of us might not, work with it again. So I think this has been great. But is there anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I think the first one is there are 2 points, I guess. And I guess the first one is to kind of really reiterate that how much like global environmental change is impacting healthcare. So I think initially we had seen that the cases in Texas and Florida, which is a little bit more in the southern United States, a little bit of a warmer climate. So something that seems like it's a little bit more likely that if malaria were to return to the United States, that it would start there. But then the fact that the state of Maryland had just recently reported a case of Plasmodium 2, and they actually released a HAN yesterday saying that the species was Falciparum, not Vivax. So this kind of goes against the usual consensus that, yeah, Vivax stays in the cooler temperate climates. Falciparum tends to stay in tropical hot climates. Well, we have Falciparum in Maryland. And I don't know how many people fly to Maryland for their tropical weather, but it's here, it's among us. So I think that's a very serious thing for us to be aware of. And we very well may in the future be seeing these increased sporadic cases in local transmission of malaria, where we also may need to begin implementing prevention and intervention strategies again within the United States. And I think the second point I wanted to bring, and as a disclosure, I have no direct involvement or affiliations with them, but anyone who might be interested, Johns Hopkins University, they hold a Future of Malaria Research Symposium every year. And this year it falls on Friday, October 13th. So if you're into spooky things or superstition, take that for what you will. But it's a hybrid conference, and that means that you can attend it both virtually or in person if you're in Baltimore, and it's free. So if malaria or the research in malaria or kind of what's going on in malaria is an area of interest to you, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. I've attended it many years ago when I was still a trainee, and it was fantastic. It's actually hosted by the trainees. So they really do it just for the love and like the promotion of science. So I can give you the link for that, Louise, if you wanted to share it in the podcast as well.
Yes, please do, and I'll go ahead and put it on the show notes along with the link to the CDC, so everyone can have that nice visual to the life cycle. But yeah, that is great, and you said that it is free.
It's free, yeah.
Okay, so definitely, if you have some time and take advantage of that. There's something, a lot of conferences, they tend to be on the pricey side. So if it's a free event, you're in the area, or maybe you have some time and you're willing to do it, yeah, go ahead and do so by all means. But I'll put it on the show notes. So yeah, I'll definitely accept that link. Well, once again, Dr. Gavina, thank you so much for taking the time to come in to Let's Talk Micro.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure.
And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about malaria. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. As always, thank you for the support. Please continue downloading episodes. I appreciate it. And if you have any feedback, any suggestions, those are definitely welcome. Very important, continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. We do such great work. And stay tuned. Great things coming your way. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.